Welcome back, everyone. I'm with John Langan, a horror writer who has some very interesting things to say in that field. John, why don't you let's get started. If you could tell the audience, kind of what the, sort of things you write about, and then just give us a brief backstory of where you're from, what you do, et cetera, and we'll get started from there.
Okay, sure. Thanks. Thanks for having me on. First off, hi everybody. If you don't know me, my name is John Langan. I write what I call Stephen King stuff. When I started off, I used to say I'm a horror writer, and very, very sort of self-righteously. And I noticed that when I said that, people's eyes, you sort of see the shutters come down. And then I started to say, I write ghost stories, which got a slightly better reaction, but at the same time wasn't quite accurate, and so I finally settled on Stephen King stuff because everybody knows who Stephen King is, and he's one of the major influences on my own writing, one of the kind of primary influences on my own writing, and he's a good enough or an accurate enough, I guess I should say, sort of touchstone for me to use and to help people understand what I'm doing. So yeah, I write primarily stories. I've written a couple of novels. My novels are called House of Windows and The Fisherman. And I have somewhere around 70 stories or thereabouts at this point, which have been published in 4 collections, soon to be 5 collections. My 5th collection, Corpse Mouth and Other Autobiographies, will be out in May. And I've won a couple of awards, the Bram Stoker Award for The Fisherman, and the This Is Horror Award for The Fisherman, and then also for my 3rd collection, which is called Saphira and Other Betrayals. So I suppose I see myself in some ways as part of that American weird tradition that embraces, on the one hand, and I'm thinking about King here as a touchstone,
Yep.
but maybe more so Peter Straub, which on the one hand embraces a kind of like domestic realism, this is how we live now, with some kind of crazy supernatural stuff, or maybe just crazy, because it's not always supernatural. Sometimes it's kind of science fictional or psychological or what have you. As to why do you write this weird stuff?
Right.
I can tell you actually, like, the sort of beginning point, which was reading King's Christine my freshman year in high school. I had read Cujo the previous summer, and the reason I'd read King was that there was a girl I went to grade school with, and she was this big Stephen King fan, and I got curious. I was like, I wonder what's up with this guy. So I read Cujo, and it didn't really make much of an impression on me. But for some reason, when Christine came out in paperback, I decided to give that a try. And man, that was it. That was just the sort of, Saul on the road to Damascus. That was just the moment of boom, this is what I need to do with the rest of my life. And, where that comes from, I'm not 100% sure. When I was 2.5, I had a little piece of metal in my right eye, in the cornea. It's for adults, it's in-office surgery, but for kids, it's you have to get knocked out and all this kind of stuff. Yeah. And I found out many years later, obviously, that both Bram Stoker and Thomas Ligotti had similar, like not eye things, but surgery when they were like 2 or thereabouts. And it made me wonder, does it have something to do with having had an experience, like a sort of horrifying experience when you're too young to process it? And in some way, it kind of shapes your resultant worldview. But that it sounds too reductive in a way. It's really cool, right? It's a way to say, that's the solution to the problem. But as from sort of artistic standpoint, you're like, wow, so all of this is a piece of metal in my eye. It doesn't sound like that's quite enough somehow. So it speaks to me in a way, I suppose, that say fantasy that's either just sort of like, say, Updikean realism or social realism, or George R.R. Martin Song of Ice and Fire outright fantasy doesn't. I mean, I love both of those things, and I'm not, it's not a knock on it, but for me, it's the place where they meet, where they converge. That's what's really interesting. That's where things get really exciting. You can I sometimes will think about, oh, I'd like to write a story about some mundane thing, and it just doesn't really, doesn't really spark my imagination. And as it were, I'm like, but if there were a zombie in it, and then suddenly things take off.
So so let's talk about The Fisherman. So an amazing book, by the way. Like, where the heck did that come from? Like, with the Rumpelstiltskin not character, but story that's kind of embedded, and then the longer narrative around that. Like, where did that come from?
Well, the Fisherman came from it came from a time in my life when I was trying to write a story a year. When I started writing and publishing, I was really afraid that I wouldn't have enough ideas. I would read about people like Neil Gaiman saying, if I like, I'll never run out of ideas until I die, and I would feel so insanely jealous. So when I published my first professionally published story, I thought to myself, okay, I want to keep doing this. And if I can just do one a year, like, I think I can manage that. And so this was a story that was just going to be a story. I had published 3 stories already. And I was like, okay, when the 3rd story was accepted for publication, I started writing the 4th story, and that 4th story just grew and grew and grew. And I was like, oh my God, I'm writing a novel. And then I freaked myself out about that too, and was like, okay, I better back off this. I'm not ready for a novel. And so, but over the course of like 12 years, I just kept coming back to it and back to it and back to it, and filling it in and a little bit more. And then I'd get an idea from some other place, and then I'd be writing another story, and I would think, oh wait, I could make a connection here. So it took a long time to write. 12 years, not 12 years of like Tolstoy day in and day out at the writing table, but sort of a process of returning to it every now and again, and then seeing what the next part of it could be.
And when you said you started it after you sold your 3rd story, let's talk a little bit about that, because there's a lot of new writers who may be listening to this, video. Where, like, how long did it take for you to get that first story published? And then, like, what was it? What was that first story? Was it a professional publication? What are the details around that?
Sure. I had published stuff in my school, my college literary magazine, in my late teens, early 20s, right, when I was an undergrad. And then for most of my 20s, I wrote a novel. I wrote a really long novel. I wrote a shorter novel. I wrote some long stories, but I wrote them. I never did anything with them. I handwrite everything. So I literally wrote them and then just set them aside. But then in my kind of mid to late 20s, I started trying to publish some short, very short kind of realist stories, and I sent them to in journals, I guess, not really professional magazines, but things like the Ontario Review, say, or Zoetrope Stories, and everything got rejected. Although I didn't realize at the time, I think it was Zoetrope in particular, actually sent me back some very encouraging rejections. But at the time, I was just like, they rejected me. I didn't have the sort of patience, I guess, or I wasn't calm enough to look at it and say, well, hang on a second, they want to see more stuff by you. This could be leading somewhere. And the thing is, the stories were okay as stories. Emotionally, when I look at them now, I see that emotionally they were dealing with the material of horror, but without fully embracing that, without going in all that, the full distance, I guess. So after that, I wrote a story. I was in graduate school for my PhD, which I never finished. And one of my classes gave you the option to write a story for the final project. So I did that. That probably took me about a month, and maybe a little bit longer. And then I was like, oh man, I want to, I think I'd like to try to publish this. And my inclination was to find like the safest venue I could, like to look at the easiest venue to get into. And my wife, who was actually at that point, she finished her PhD. She had finished her PhD. No, she hadn't. No, she had. Okay, she had finished her PhD at that point. She went to Penn State, and her professors had told her, when you have an article to publish, you make a list of like the top 10 publications that article could appear in, and you start at the very top, and then you work your way down. And this way, okay, maybe you don't get in at the top, but if you get in at like number 9, let's say, even number 10, that's still going to be higher than what you were probably looking at to begin with. So so I had this story that was a novelette called On Skua Island, and the only magazine that I could find was a magazine of fantasy and science fiction. That was the only one that would accept something of that length. So this was the old days when you put things in envelopes and, had a cover letter and that sort of stuff. And so I sent the story off to them. And I'd say within maybe a month, maybe a little bit less than a month, I got a check in the mail. No letter, just a check in the mail. And I was like, I don't know what this means.
Wait, that was your first submission to the magazine?
Yeah. And but my first submission, after having been writing for, in a way, since I was a teenager, like on the one hand, it seems like, oh my God, but on the other hand, when I think, yeah, but I was seriously, after I read Christine, right, my freshman year of high school, I started writing, and in a way, I didn't stop. And as I said, there were those long things I wrote in my 20s. So by the time I got to that moment, I had been writing, somewhere in the order of like 16 or 17 years. So that it was, don't get me wrong, it was still a home run. There's no, I was, and that, the editor just really liked it because it was kind of different from what he was used to. And so he gave me the cover illustration, and it got good reviews, and it was nominated for an award, which it didn't win, and which at the time I was kind of frustrated, because you're always frustrated when you don't win an award. But in retrospect, I'm like, oh, thank God I didn't, because I think if I had, I would have been like, well, I'm done. I got the sort of major publication, I got money, I got good reviews, I got an award. What more do I need? But that, after that story was finished, I just started trying to work on the next one, but with an eye towards having that submitted before, because it takes about a year for your stories to come out in print publications. It probably does even in the major online publications. So I wanted to have something in the mail to those guys before the first story appeared. And because I guess I figured either way, like when On Skua Island appeared, either I was like, thinking very, either it's going to be great, everybody's going to love it, or they're going to hate it. And either way, I wanted the next story to be in, so that wasn't interfering with my head. And
I do the same thing with anthologies, right?
Yeah.
Like I had no idea how successful this like Weird World War III would be. No idea. Mm-hmm. So as soon as I could, I sent in another pitch. Yeah. And then and you just have to, because you never know if something's going to be successful or not. But I got lucky. Now, the toughest thing is when somebody is successful very early, yes, and then they get a rejection. Like, yes. How do you talk people through that one?
Well, I used to say, I used to teach college creative writing. And one of the things I would say to my students is, we spend a lot of time preparing you for failure, but we don't spend much time preparing you for success. And success can be as crippling as failure. If you send your story and it gets rejected, well, that's what, of course, everybody gets rejected, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. If you're successful, though, we don't teach you about that. And then, of course, the thing with success, if you have a string of successes and then you hit that first failure, or if you have one success and then you have a string of failures, and here's the thing, it's not a failure. It's just, you didn't place your story, like failure is I don't even know what failure would be. By not trying, I guess would be failing, not giving it your best shot.
Yeah, you're not going to succeed if you don't try.
Yeah, and it's just that genius, as Henry James said, does not require perfection. So that you don't have to make it perfect. You just have to make it the best you can make it, and off it goes. So but let's say you've been accepted, and then rejected. I think you send it to the next place. That's you find the next place to send it to, and the next place after that, and the next place after that, and you keep working on whatever the next story is. I think that's and it's difficult to do. I think, or maybe early on, it's difficult not to put all your eggs in that one basket and think this is it. This is going to be the story. I mean, it may be, but even if it is the story, it could take 18 months to reach publication, depending. So what are you going to do in the meantime? Are you going to just sort of sit around for 18 months? I mean, that's writing time that you could be doing something with. So I would say, if you're whatever your dream market was, or whatever project you were submitting this story for rejects the story, that's okay. Just turn around, send it someplace else, and then start working on the next story. Easier said than done, I know. But if you want to persist, if you want to keep going, these are the kinds of skills that you have to work on developing.
Yeah, you have to A, love it, and then be stubborn as a mule.
Yeah, I think so. I think that there are lots of other ways to spend your time, and if there's a great line at the beginning of Moby Dick, where Ishmael says something to the effect of, whenever I find myself getting really just sort of irritated and irritable and such, that's when I know it's time to go to sea. And I think about that for myself with writing, that if I find myself just becoming really sort of crabby, where I'm like, oh, have I been writing recently? Nah, I've been doing other things. I really need to get to writing. So yeah, if that's kind of my view of what it takes to persist as a writer. It's not to say that you can't write one story and publish it. Sure, lots of people do that. But if you want to keep on keeping on, then you're going to need something inside, some kind of internal drive.
Now let's change gears a little bit. You talked very briefly about Stephen King being, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but your primary influence.
Sure.
What other writers have influenced you? And looking at your own writing, if you put yourself into the position of an outsider, what influences would they see?
I think they would probably see King and probably Peter Straub. I think they would find the two of them there. I've been, I think what's interesting is that when I look at my own life, like I remember reading Robert E. Howard in fifth grade math class. Apologies, Sister Ann. And Howard's stories really did have a powerful early influence on me in a way that, say, Lovecraft's didn't. I came to Lovecraft much later, and I really respect his achievement, but and I think it's really cool, but it doesn't engage me at that same kind of primary sort of gut level. So I think about someone like Howard, I think about King, I think about Straub, a little bit later on, people like Henry James and Dickens. And I suppose someone might, depending on what story you were reading, you might see those guys, because sometimes, depending on the story I'm writing, I like really elaborate prose. And so you might be like, oh, right, I can sort of see where the Henry James is there. But I kind of feel surprised sometimes. People will say, oh yeah, I see a lot of Aikman in you, and I'll think, well, I haven't really read a lot of Aikman, but thanks for the compliment. And that's kind of fascinating to me. When I was a kid, I read a lot of comic books. This was the great Marvel age of the 70s, when Stan Lee was still writing some, but it was mostly like Roy Thomas and Marv Wolfman and Len Wein, and those guys had a huge impact on me in ways, their kind of love of melodrama, of sort of family situations and complications and difficulties for the heroes. I think that's still in the background of my kind of artistic consciousness.
And as you kind of think about some of the themes that you write about, what would you say kind of your most common themes?
Um, I don't know. which I mean, I know is such a cop out kind of answer. I'm really
Well, it's not an easy question. It seems like it's a simple question, but it's easier to find themes in other people's work. It's harder to find themes in your own because you're caught in the work of it. But sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, not at all. I think that's absolutely true. And there were times. So when I published my third collection, which is called Sapphira and Other Betrayals, I had a group of stories. I was looking to put together my third collection, and I had a group of stories, and I realized that like about 8 of those stories were all about betrayal. I had written them over a relatively short span of time, and in various ways, they all dealt with betrayal. And I had a couple of stories that I had that I had in the works, and I was like, oh man, those 2 stories are also about betrayal. They would fit. So, like at that particular point in time, I was like, okay, I'm really interested in betrayal here. So, all right. The collection after that, my most recent collection, Children of the Fang, I called it genealogies because all the story, there was a subtitle in Other Genealogies. All the stories there had been written for tribute anthologies, or most of them had to different writers. And I was like, so it seemed to me that like I was kind of working out without meaning to, like a kind of loose family tree. But I think that those, you probably could have switched those subtitles, and you probably could have had Sapphira and Other Genealogies, Children of the Fang and Other Betrayals, and either of those lenses would probably fit, I think, to as a way to view what was going on in those stories. My forthcoming collection it makes very strong use of autobiographical elements, and I'm sure there's something there too that I was working through. I guess a lot of my creative process involves trusting my own subconscious or unconscious, I guess.
Or the voices in your head, wherever they may come.
That's right. Well, D.H. Lawrence famously said, in trying to describe himself, he said something to the effect of myself is like a little fire in a clearing surrounded by a dark forest, and from that forest, strange gods come and go. And I've always loved that. I've always loved that description. Mine tends to be more of like, I think that my consciousness is sort of like a skyscraper or something, and that like where I live is like the penthouse on the top, but that's where my consciousness is. And then all the layers down, all the levels down to the basement, to the sub-basement, to the caves underneath, that's where all sorts of different things are happening, different memories. I think that's probably where my kind of creative unconscious is working. There's probably several floors where things are getting passed up and passed down, and then eventually they might be put in the elevator and brought up to the top. And hey boss, we heard you were looking for this idea. Look, it's here. We've got it right here. So that's kind of how I think, and I or how I conceive it, I guess. And I try to allow, at this point in my life, I guess I try to allow that stuff to happen, just to have a sort of faith that it will happen. That not only that it will happen, that it is happening.
Now, which writers do you enjoy reading today?
Oh my goodness, there's so many.
Sorry, contemporary. Oh, sorry, let me be clear. Living writers who are writing today.
Yes. Living, or at least partially.
Right.
I mean, I'm good friends with Laird Barron, with Paul Tremblay, with Stephen Graham Jones, Sarah Langan, Glenn Hirschberg, Nathan Ballingrud, Livia Llewellyn, Victor Laval. I see us all, and I'm sure there's 1 or 2 others in there too, that I see us all as we're all of roughly the same generation, and there's a really interesting. A lot of us are sort of children of Stephen King, and Peter Straub. We all read those guys coming up, and now we're doing our different things. Beyond those guys, Nadia Balkin, Grady Hendrix, books. Grady will never forgive me if I forget his name. And Erica Sativka, whom I met. Sativka, yeah. Through I ran into her work through Weird World War III.
She's great, isn't she?
She's really terrific. AC Wise, who's a new collection out from Undertow Press that's just terrific. There's really Gemma Files. I don't know if I mentioned her already, but if not, even if I did, she's worth mentioning again. So there's just this astonishing group of writers at work right now. And there's no, I feel like there's no shortage of stuff for me to read. Even if I were just to confine myself to that group of about 14 writers, they've all among the lot of them, they produced so much great stuff that I'm not going to run out of stuff to read anytime soon.
Now you have a story in Weird World War III and a story in Weird World War IV. The story in Weird World War IV is a play.
It is.
How did that happen?
So I had, a few years ago, I wrote a story. It was actually like a private, so it was a story for a friend, and it was a kind of riff on Peter Pan. Peter Pan meets Heart of Darkness, and it was eventually published. And then a few years after that, I wrote another story that was like a sort of Alice in Wonderland riff. It was sort of like Alice in Wonderland meets Brexit. And then when I was thinking about the Weird World War IV thing, I was thinking about like those sorts of children's stories, and I was thinking about T.H. White, the Once and Future King, and I love the King Arthur story, and I've always wanted to do something with the King Arthur story. I remember as a kid being astonished to find out that John Steinbeck, when he died, he was working on a translation of Le Morte d'Arthur, which has been published, The Acts of King Arthur and His Noble Knights. And so I thought, maybe I'll do like an Arthur kind of thing. Maybe because of course the thing with Arthur, right, is he's supposed to return at the end, some kind of end times, right, in the time of great crisis. But so are a bunch of other heroes, Charlemagne, Frederick Barbarossa, Ogier the Dane. And so it seemed like there was something, kind of worth doing there. And I, for whatever reason, I just, every now and again, I'll try to mix things up structure-wise in what I'm writing. And I had not written, I've only written two things in kind of play form. One is an old story called How the Day Runs Down, which is like Thornton Wilder's Our Town with zombies. And then another very tiny story that was an afterword to a deluxe edition of my second collection. So so I thought that like a play was not something that I had done to death. And I guess I had in mind too, I was thinking about traveling players. It's interesting that is it Station 11 is about the group of traveling players in the kind of post-apocalyptic landscape. So and I hadn't read that or seen that, but in some weird way, anyway, I liked that idea of you're watching this play, and maybe you're in the play too. I love that when you can sort of collapse those distances, but also it puts a lot of I think what I like about that format is the way that it puts so much pressure really on the dialogue. What that you have to, the characters have to express themselves almost only through the dialogue, and so it seemed like an interesting kind of challenge too.
Yeah, it was definitely an interesting story. And then your Weird World War III story was one of my favorites, just from the sheer imagery. Just really quick, like kind of a, I wouldn't say a summary, but if you could give listeners a tease on what that story is about.
Secret moon bases. We had one and the Soviets had them. And when the big hot one went up in 1983 after Operation Able Archer turned hot, we found out that there were evil space lobsters up there as well.
From Lovecraftian.
Yeah. The funny thing is I actually thought that for some reason I had it in mind that the anthology had requested that there was a supposed to be a Lovecraftian element in it. Like I misread it, but that
no, you didn't misread it at all. Like,
oh really? Okay.
Some people just interpreted it a lot more liberally. than
Oh, okay. So
you did.
so no,
No, you
so
were right. You were right on the money. Right on the money.
I thought about the Me Go, and I thought, okay, what can you do with the Me Go, and that yeah, that tied into other stuff. Many years ago, John Joseph Adams had edited an anthology called Power Armor, and I'd had this idea for a story about these guys who were like sort of like Heinlein Starship Troopers,
Mhm.
like in the mecha suits or whatever, fighting Lovecraftian entities, and they were swapping out parts of their suits for bits of the Lovecraftian entities' armor, and it just
Yeah.
never, it never became anything more than just like a video game, in my head. But that made its way ultimately into this story.
Yeah, that was extremely creative, and I love that element. It was with the cat, right?
A cat.
The cat. All right. Well, last question. If people want to find you, where can they go? And then what projects and books? So what books should they check out? And then what projects are you working on? That's like 3 questions all bundled into one.
Sure. So they can I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Instagram. I think if they wanted to check something out, the Fisherman, people seem to like that. So it's a novel. That's a good place to start. Children of the Fang, as far as collections go, is probably my most diverse collection. I really wanted a collection that had like a lot of different things in it. So either of those would be good starting points. In terms of what's coming out next, book wise, my very first collection, Mr. Gaunt's and Other Uneasy Encounters, is being reissued. I'm just putting the finishing touches, actually, as this morning, on a new story that will be part of it. So that should be out within like a month to 6 weeks. And then my next original, fully or fully new collection, Corpse Mouth and Other Autobiographies, will be out in May. I'll have novellas forthcoming in John Taft's Dark Stars, which should be out again within about like a month and a half, and another one in Ellen Datlow's Big Monster book, which I think is coming out in June, although the date on that may have been pushed back a little bit. And a story in Weird World War IV,
which comes out March 1st.
Yeah,
about a week actually. All right. There's one thing you mentioned as a kind of a teaser. So you mentioned Frederick Barbarossa.
Mm-hmm.
There's a tie from Frederick Barbarossa to our next topic, and we'll explain it. We'll explain it in the next, or we'll talk about it in the next episode. So thank you everyone for joining us, and please do check out the next episode when it is finally revealed. And see you soon, John.
See you soon, Sean. Thanks.